What if I told you that the Stoicism we know today is just a shadow of a far greater truth? That the wisdom of Zeno, Chrysippus, and Musonius Rufus was once far more radical, so dangerous that empires tried to bury it. Philosophers were erased from memory, and manuscripts were deliberately burned. But the fire of truth has a strange nature. The more it's suppressed, the brighter it burns. According to the ancient historian Tertullian, more than 700 works by Chrysippus once existed. None survived in full. Zeno's bold masterpiece, The Republic, vanished from history. And Musonius Rufus, the man Romans called their Socrates, was nearly silenced for teaching that virtue belongs to both men and women alike. Even Marcus Aurelius, writing centuries later, sensed that he was holding fragments of a greater philosophy. Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one. Centuries later, William B. Irvine would remind us that we have inherited only the bones of Stoicism, and it's our duty to bring its living spirit back. Don't settle for fragments of Stoicism, he wrote. Seek the complete philosophy that can transform your entire life. And that's exactly what we'll do today. We'll act as archaeologists of the mind, unearthing the forbidden layers of Stoic wisdom that history almost erased. Each fragment we'll uncover hides a truth so powerful it could reshape how we see life, society, and even ourselves. This is the Stoic Lighthouse. Let its light guide you toward peace and wisdom. If this journey already resonates with you, hit the like button and subscribe. That's how you help this light reach more people who seek calm in the chaos. Because what you're about to discover are the lost ideas that the ancient world feared and the modern world desperately needs. Number 1. Zeno's Lost Republic, a dream of equality. Picture this: Athens 300 years before Christ. A shipwreck survivor named Zeno of Citium washes ashore with nothing but his mind, and from the ruins of his fortune, he builds a philosophy that would outlast empires. Standing beneath the painted colonnades of the Stoa Poikile, he begins to teach not kings, not elites, but ordinary men and women walking the streets. That was already radical enough. But Zeno's most audacious idea was one that history tried to erase completely. His missing masterpiece, The Republic, was not the cold utopia of Plato's imagination. It was a vision of true equality, one so far ahead of its time that it made even the Roman Senate tremble. Zeno dared to dream of a world without nations, without slavery, without the walls that separate human beings into castes and classes. According to the few fragments that survived, Zeno envisioned humanity as one universal family. We should not live in separate cities or nations, but see all men as fellow citizens and share one common life, like a flock feeding together in a shared pasture. It was not a fantasy. It was a declaration of human unity, centuries before the words human rights ever existed. This wasn't just philosophy, it was a rebellion. Rome would later turn Stoicism into a moral code that served the empire: obedience, duty, discipline. But Zeno's original dream was dangerous because it dissolved the very structures of power Rome relied on. In Zeno's city, women and men stood as equals. Citizenship wasn't earned by birth or wealth, but by virtue and reason. Marcus Aurelius would echo this centuries later when he wrote, "As a human being, my city and my homeland is the world." That single line was the echo of Zeno's Lost Republic, a whisper from a vanished manuscript that still defies borders, tribes, and flags. Today, modern Stoic voices like Ryan Holiday bring this same idea into the modern age. Every human being, no matter how frustrating, different, or cruel, shares the same divine reason that you do. Think about that in our time. A world split by ideology, identity, and endless conflict. What Zeno offered wasn't naive idealism, it was a call to sanity, a reminder that beneath our politics and prejudices, we're citizens of the same cosmos. And in an era where nationalism divides and outrage fuels attention, the lost vision of Zeno feels more urgent than ever. William B. Irvine once wrote, "When we learn to see ourselves as part of something larger, we find that the path to peace runs through the heart of community." Zeno's Forgotten Republic wasn't just a philosophical sketch. It was the blueprint for a future humanity still hasn't built, a civilization ruled not by wealth or status, but by wisdom. And perhaps the most haunting truth is this: if his book had survived intact, the world we live in today might have been very different. Number 2, Chrysippus and the Cosmic Mind, the Forgotten Interconnection. Imagine standing beneath a star-filled sky in ancient Greece, feeling the vastness of the cosmos pressing against your thoughts. To most people, those stars were distant gods, silent and unreachable. But to Chrysippus of Soli, they were alive, each one a spark of the same divine fire that burned within every human soul. Chrysippus, the man often called the second founder of Stoicism, wrote more than 700 books to explain how everything in existence, from galaxies to grains of sand, was bound together by one invisible force, Logos, the rational soul of the universe. He believed that nothing in creation stood alone. Every event, every heartbeat, every movement of wind or wave was part of a sacred pattern. According to Chrysippus, it is impossible to find a single part of the universe, however small, that is not connected to the whole, and that the whole does not depend on. This wasn't poetic exaggeration. It was his way of describing a living universe, one in which every act of kindness or cruelty rippled across the cosmic fabric. To harm another person was to harm yourself, because we are threads woven from the same divine substance. Centuries later, Marcus Aurelius echoed that same truth in his Meditations. All things are woven together, and the sacred bond unites them. And even today, modern thinkers like Massimo Pigliucci bring this wisdom back to life, reminding us that the good of the individual is inseparable from the good of the human community. Again, if Zeno taught us that we are citizens of the world, Chrysippus taught us that we are citizens of the cosmos. His insight, known as sympathia, reveals a moral law that transcends religion or nationality. When we understand that our existence is interdependent, compassion stops being a virtue and becomes common sense. In a world obsessed with individuality, self-expression, and personal branding, Chrysippus offers a shocking counterpoint, that true freedom begins the moment we stop seeing ourselves as isolated. Every tweet, every purchase, every argument, it all ripples outward. Every action shapes the whole. William B. Irvine expands this concept for modern life. When we learn to see ourselves as part of something greater, we stop asking, "What do I want?" and start asking, "What serves the whole?" This cosmic awareness isn't abstract mysticism, it's practical clarity. It changes how we deal with others, how we forgive, how we serve, how we lead. It's what allows a parent to see the world through their child's eyes, or a stranger to help another without expecting anything in return. Even science, millennia later, has caught up to Chrysippus. Quantum physics speaks of entanglement, ecology speaks of interdependence, psychology speaks of empathy, all different words for what the Stoics already knew. Everything is connected, and if we lose sight of that truth, we lose sight of what makes us human. Because when you understand that the universe breathes through you, you stop fighting against it and start living in harmony with it. Number 3, Musonius Rufus and the revolutionary equality. In the heart of the Roman Empire, when women were seen as property and slaves were voices without names, one philosopher stood against the tide. His name was Musonius Rufus, the man they called the Roman Socrates. He taught that virtue, not privilege, defined a person's worth, and that wisdom, the highest form of freedom, belonged to every human soul. Musonius didn't write books. His words survived through the memories of his students, whispered across generations, because what he said was too dangerous to be recorded openly. In an empire ruled by hierarchy, he declared something revolutionary, that men and women were equal in their capacity for virtue, reason, and courage. And according to Musonius Rufus, why should men study philosophy to become good, and women not? Do women not have the same capacity for reason and virtue as men? It was an idea that shattered the foundations of Rome's patriarchy. Philosophers of his time called him idealistic, but Musonius didn't care about approval. He cared about truth. He believed that philosophy was not a luxury for the educated elite. It was the art of living well, meant for everyone who dared to think, question, and act with integrity. Seneca, though more cautious in his writings, shared the same conviction when he wrote, "Virtue is accessible to all who seek it." Centuries later, this same spark would reappear in thinkers who shaped the modern world. The words of Marcus Aurelius, "As a human being, my city is the world," echoed Musonius's belief in universal brotherhood. And in our time, the philosopher Nancy Sherman reminds us that Musonius was not ahead of his time, he was ahead of ours. As Sherman explains, virtue has no gender, women are just as capable of developing it as men. Musonius's influence stretches across millennia, from Epictetus, his devoted student, to modern voices like Ryan Holiday, who insists that philosophy should never be kept behind academic gates. As Holiday puts it, philosophy is the tool of humanity. To exclude anyone from it is to amputate part of who we are. Musonius Rufus didn't just teach equality, he lived it. Banished twice by emperors, he chose exile over silence. He taught philosophy to farmers, soldiers, and mothers. He saw no difference between the wisdom needed in a palace and the wisdom needed in a kitchen. And his message is still as subversive as it was 2,000 years ago. In a culture that worships image over integrity, Musonius reminds us that virtue isn't inherited, it's earned through daily struggle. His forgotten lesson is this: freedom doesn't begin when society gives you permission. It begins when you claim ownership over your own soul. Number 4. Panaetius and the humanized Stoicism. When people think of Stoicism, they imagine a rigid code, a philosophy that teaches you to suppress emotions, reject pleasure, and endure pain in silence. But that was never its true essence. The Stoic who broke that misconception was Panaetius of Rhodes, a philosopher who dared to make Stoicism human. He looked at the sharp edges of ancient doctrine and softened them just enough to fit the real world. Panaetius lived during the rise of the Roman Republic, a time when philosophy had become a showpiece for elites. He challenged that by making Stoicism practical, livable, and compassionate. His lost masterpiece On Duties became so influential that even Cicero borrowed from it, reshaping Roman ethics. But history, as usual, kept Cicero's name and forgot the original mind that inspired him. According to ancient sources, Panaetius questioned one of the hardest Stoic teachings, that everything except virtue was indifferent. He believed that while virtue remained the highest good, it was unrealistic to dismiss the value of health, joy, or love. These things might not define a good life, but they support it. His approach was revolutionary because it brought warmth into a philosophy often seen as cold. As Marcus Aurelius later wrote in his Meditations, "Do not despise life, but learn to live in harmony with nature." That single line reflects Panaetius' spirit, to embrace life as it is, not as a test of endurance, but as a field for growth. In modern times, William B. Irvine builds upon this same idea when he says, "You don't have to become a perfect Stoic to live well. Apply the core principles and you will already be better for it." Panaetius understood something that many forget. Philosophy is not about building walls between wisdom and emotion, but about creating balance. He believed that the Stoic sage was not a stone statue, but a breathing human being who learns, stumbles, forgives, and grows. Massimo Pigliucci reinforces this modern echo. The goal of Stoicism is not to create flawless sages, but better humans, one decision at a time. Panaetius was not trying to dilute Stoicism. He was saving it from becoming dogma. In his time, critics accused him of being too soft, but he saw compassion and practicality as extensions of reason, not weaknesses. For him, philosophy had no meaning if it couldn't help you face a sick child, a lost job, or a broken heart. He gave Stoicism a pulse. He made it human, and in doing so, he bridged the gap between the ideal and the attainable, between the gods the Stoics admired and the mortals who needed guidance. Perhaps that's why his ideas still feel so modern, because we're still learning that strength isn't the absence of emotion, it's the mastery of it. Number 5, Posidonius and the scientific wisdom lost. If Panaetius brought heart into Stoicism, Posidonius of Apamea gave it intellect. He was known as the universal philosopher, a man who refused to separate wisdom from science, ethics from physics, or logic from wonder. He believed that to live well, one must understand the universe not as a mystery to be worshipped, but as a system to be studied. Posidonius lived in an age where myth ruled minds, yet he spoke of tides moved by the moon, of stars as burning suns, of the cosmos as one breathing organism. To him, studying nature wasn't a distraction from philosophy, it was philosophy. It was how a human being came to understand the divine logic behind existence itself. According to ancient sources, Posidonius taught that the philosopher must not only reflect but observe, because the universe itself was the first teacher. His blend of reason and curiosity inspired generations of thinkers, including Cicero, who once said, "I traveled to Rhodes to hear Posidonius and found not just a philosopher, but a man who seemed to know all that was worth knowing." What made Posidonius controversial wasn't his brilliance, but his defiance. In a time when religion demanded obedience, he sought understanding. He believed that wisdom and science were two wings of the same bird, and to cut off one was to fall into ignorance. Donald Robertson, one of today's leading Stoic scholars, describes this union perfectly. Stoicism has always been a philosophy of practical life, but it was never divorced from scientific curiosity. The study of nature was essential for understanding our place within it. And that insight, buried by centuries of dogma, feels more urgent than ever. We live in a time when technology advances faster than wisdom. We map galaxies, split atoms, and simulate consciousness. Yet we still struggle to master our own emotions. Posidonius would tell us that progress without virtue is blindness. William B. Irvine reminds us, when we recognize the greater order of nature, our problems shrink in proportion. Posidonius taught that contemplating the vastness of the cosmos humbles the ego and heals the restless mind. The same mind that worries about emails, bills, or reputation begins to see its smallness against the eternal rhythm of the stars. Modern scientists like Carl Sagan echoed this Stoic insight centuries later when he said, "We are a way for the cosmos to know itself." That line could have come straight from Posidonius. He showed that philosophy isn't an escape from reality. It's the deepest engagement with it. It's the study of cause and consequence, from the movements of planets to the storms of human emotion. And perhaps that's the greatest loss of all. Not just his writings, but the bridge he built between reason and wonder, because in the end, Posidonius reminds us that to understand the universe is to understand ourselves, and that every act of curiosity is an act of reverence. Number 6. Hierocles and the circles of humanity, the ethics of connection. Among the forgotten voices of Stoicism, one philosopher spoke quietly, yet his ideas ripple across centuries like waves widening in a calm sea. His name was Hierocles, and while time has buried most of his writings, one fragment survived, a metaphor so powerful that it could rebuild the moral architecture of the modern world. Hierocles imagined every human life surrounded by circles. At the center, the self. Around it, family, friends, city, nation, and finally all of humanity. The task of the wise person, he said, was not to remain trapped in the inner circle, but to draw the outer ones closer, to bring strangers into the warmth of our concern until the distance between me and we disappears. According to Hierocles, we should draw the circles of affection toward the center, making all mankind part of our concern. This wasn't sentimentality. It was strategy, an ethical blueprint for empathy. Centuries before psychology, Hierocles understood that virtue grows from connection, that the mind expands when compassion does. His vision was Stoic, but it spoke to something deeply human, the desire to belong and to make others belong. Ryan Holiday echoes this idea for the modern age. When you see yourself as part of something larger, the petty things lose their hold on you. In an age defined by division, politics, race, ideology, wealth, Hierocles' wisdom feels prophetic. He anticipated our current dilemma. How to live ethically in a world where technology connects us, yet empathy fades. His circles of humanity challenge us to turn followers into friends, opponents into fellow citizens, and the anonymous into the familiar. Marcus Aurelius embodied that same ideal in his Meditations. What injures the hive injures the bee. Every social injustice, every cruelty, every indifference, it all eventually returns to us because we are threads of the same web. Hierocles' circles remind us that morality is not about isolation, but inclusion. Stoic ethics at its core was never a solitary journey. It was a call to community. Massimo Pigliucci expands on this principle for the modern world. The Stoic idea of cosmopolitanism means acting as if every person you meet were family, because in a moral sense they are. This idea transforms daily life. It means that the clerk at the store, the driver in traffic, or the stranger online all exist within your moral circle. And every act of patience, forgiveness, or kindness isn't small. It's cosmic. It strengthens the entire web of human reason that Stoics called logos. William B. Irvine explains this beautifully. Stoicism teaches us not just how to live with others, but how to live for others. Hierocles gives us a mirror for our times. While algorithms divide us into tribes, his forgotten insight calls us to rebuild the ancient human truth, that virtue begins when we remember we are one family. If Zeno dreamed of a world united by reason, Hierocles gave us the map for how to live inside it, not through politics or slogans, but through the daily, deliberate act of pulling every circle closer, until the world feels small enough to care for and big enough to belong to. From Zeno's dream of universal equality to Chrysippus's cosmic web, from Musonius Rufus's defiance of patriarchy to Panaetius's human warmth, from Posidonius's union of science and soul to Hierocles' circles of empathy, these are not just ancient names lost in time. They are blueprints for how to live when the world seems unlivable. Empires fell, fires burned libraries, tyrants silenced voices, but Stoicism refused to die. Because its truth was not written only on paper, it was carved into human nature itself. You can't erase what was born to endure. Marcus Aurelius once reminded himself, "What stands in the way becomes the way." And that is the heartbeat of Stoicism. Every obstacle, every heartbreak, every loss, it all becomes material for transformation. The Stoics didn't escape pain. They forged strength from it. They didn't hide from the storm. They became the calm within it. William B. Irvine calls Stoicism the manual for being unbreakable in a broken world. And that's what it is, a philosophy for warriors of the soul. A code that tells you, even when everything collapses, stand tall, act with virtue, and the world will follow your example. So tell me, Which of these forgotten ideas struck you the deepest? Zeno's dream of equality, Chrysippus' living universe, Musonius' rebellion against injustice, Panaetius' human balance, Posidonius' cosmic curiosity, or Hierocles' call for empathy across all humanity? Let me know in the comments. Your reflection might spark someone else's awakening. If this video spoke to you, like it, share it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next light that rises from the Stoic Lighthouse. Because next time, we'll explore the mind of a man who carried the weight of an entire nation, a leader who fought inner darkness while guiding his country through its greatest crisis. A story that proves that even in the depths of despair, Stoic strength can save not only a man, but a nation's soul. As Seneca once wrote, "Fire tests gold, and adversity tests the brave." See you in the next video.